Made in Latin America.
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 Welcome to Made in Latin America, a new podcast brought to you by the Santo Domingo Centre of Excellence for Latin American Research at the British Museum. In this podcast, you'll be listening to insights and interpretations about iconic collections at the British Museum, as well as examples from the more than 60,000 items, of which many have never been on display. Join us in this series that will deepen and challenge what you know about Latin America.
This season explores the Toninteye Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Hispanic pictorial manuscripts made more than 500 years ago in the Mixtec region in Mexico. In which language is it written? Why is its blue color so unique? What stories does it tell? The podcast will be hosted by two curators from the Latin America Center, Laura Osorio Sonax and Maria Mercedes Martinez Milanchi. Indigenous researchers, communities, and artists working with this codex will join us throughout the season.
Hi, everybody. This is Mercedes and Laura from the Santo Domingo Center of Excellence for Latin American Research at the British Museum, and welcome to the Made in Latin America podcast. In this last episode, we'll talk about contemporary codices made by artists and activists that are using historical images to express political realities in Mexico and the Mexico-U.S. border. Just to remind you how it's going to work, me and Laura are going to have a conversation, and then we'll have some comments from different specialists, and throughout the episode, you'll be listening to a creative retelling of the Toninteye Codex read by Miguel Villegas Ventura.
A year and a day from the death of his shadow, Lord A. Dio memorializes the Temazcal and what happened in the steam and the darkness. He walks the sacred road. He dresses in funereal robes. He stops at the temple and drinks the milky yeast foam of the pulque, the drink of the gods. It's alcohol fuzz to commemorate and to remember. And if we hold our cameras tight, we might see a king in mourning. By slide our focus wider, and another figure might come into frame. A man with a smiling mouth and the sitting knees and the blood-stained hands of the Temazcal healer with the blade in the cut branches. He might be sitting there too, drinking the pulque, smiling in the ceremonial remembrance for the man that he killed.
Welcome to today's podcast, where we will be focusing on three contemporary codices made in Mexico and the United States in the past few years. So first, we're going to discuss the Rodriguez Mondragon Codex, which was created by Sandy Rodriguez, a Mexican-American artist raised on the California-Mexico border. So Laura, can you tell us a little about this codex?
Yeah, it's actually the codex is part of a series of paintings made by Sandy Rodriguez, and she uses natural pigments to create what look like almost more like Western cartographic styles, Western maps, but with figures drawn onto the map that employ colonial-era codex or convent wall painting style figures. So, Códice Rodríguez Mondragón is a codex that shows basically a lot of different political contexts and social contexts from the region, but all on the same map. So I think what's quite interesting there is that you have things that are supposed to have happened, let's say the repatriation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans off the Texas coastline from 1929 to 1936. So that's shown by a freighter off the edge of the Texas coastline. But we also have the detention centers that were built in the region in 2018 that refer to the separation of immigrant families in the U.S. policy. So it draws together different periods of history on one space, fracturing this idea of the relationship between territory and timelines.
Yeah, and it's really powerful, the images used of contemporary U.S. today, right? Because you have ICE agents with the helmets and body armor, like capturing residents and activists. And you also then see the contrast with like Spanish vessels and weapons. And then you also can see even like drones and marine vessels, just like the war machine from the USA, right?
Absolutely. And I think that idea of a visual nowness is reinforced by the fact that she uses these natural pigments that she gets from the local landscape. So it sort of draws you into this idea of something historical that reminds us of codices, because of course codices were painted with natural pigments and employed natural materials, amate paper or deerskin, etc. But it also tells us of the contemporary environment, because these are pigments that have been sourced recently.
Yeah, and she's really drawing from the Florentine Codex, right, which is actually named The General History of the Things of New Spain by Bernardino de Sahagún in the 16th century and compiled by Nahua scribes, right?
That's right, yeah. What the Tlacuilos used to do, the Tlacuilos are the Mesoamerican writers. That was their, scribes, if you want. What they do is they do conflate different actions in different places and different times, and that's what the Florentine Codex does, and what a lot of different codices actually from the colonial period do to sort of tell stories. And a lot of those codices, what they do is they reclaim territory. So they're a way of communicating different lineages, for example, or different spatial arrangements according to indigenous logics and indigenous structures for the Spanish colonial administration in order to effectively lobby for continued indigenous power relations. And so, in a sense, that's what the Códice Rodríguez Mondragón does, because it's named after her family, who are Mexicans living in the United States, but telling the story, as you say, of all of the injustices that Mexican Americans experience on that territory, to show that it's the borders themselves that have crossed over these people. It's not people who have crossed over the borders. So it's a resistance against the narrative of the noxious Mexican immigration into the United States.
Definitely. And it's also a nudge to our own cultural heritage as a Mexican American, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it makes it personal because, of course, it's so easy to see a lot of these kinds of artworks as being political activism, which they, of course, are. But by calling the codex by her own family name, she's tying those political experiences to her own family and to her own positionality.
Definitely. And it's also the story of many thousands of people that can really relate to not only her personal story, but also the outrage against U.S. contemporary politics in the past few years.
Absolutely. I think it was a series of artworks that can say as much to Mexicans and Latin Americans on U.S. soil as it does to people in Mexico.
And that makes it really special, because artworks that are based on codices that you usually find in museums to speak to such a wide array of people is really a way to get people interested in these codices in the first place, right?
You're totally right. And I think that that's the other thing about anthropology museums. So art museums tend to be, I think, to some extent, slightly more inclusive in the way that they represent cultural and transnationality, etc., cultural hybridity. But anthropology museums often divide, for example, culturally speaking, the settler colonialism in the United States and Canada from Mexico and further south in Latin America. And so she effectively challenges those territorial cultural divisions.
And so another codex that you've worked with more closely, because it was in one of the exhibits you curated at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC in Canada, is the Ayotzinapa Codex. So why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So, this is a codex that, as you say, is closer to my experience. It was a codex that I actually acquired for MOA UBC in 2018. It was made in 2014 following the Ayotzinapa disappearances. So for anyone listening who doesn't know what happened, there were 43 students from the Escuela Isidro Burgos, which is in the state of Guerrero in Mexico, in southern Mexico, and they went missing. They are forced disappearance, and they're presumed dead. Obviously, that was something which was very highly publicized in Mexico. There were lots of national and international investigations into those disappearances. The families of the 43 students, who are predominantly indigenous, they were student teachers. They are still lobbying in Reforma, which is one of the main streets in Mexico City, effectively for justice and for public acknowledgement or governmental acknowledgement of that human rights violation. Obviously, this is not the only circumstance in Mexico in recent years of large-scale disappearances of indigenous people, predominantly women. In this case, they're predominantly men, which is linked to governmental corruption and linked to drug trafficking, a lot of the other sort of legacies of colonialism and neoliberalism now. But it's a story that garnered a lot of public interest. It definitely does speak to some of the ongoing problematic race relations in Mexico regarding the way that indigenous peoples are treated and the variable degrees to which they receive, legal justice. When that atrocity happened, these two guys, Juan Manuel Sandoval Palacios and Diego Sandoval Avila, father and son actually, decided to create the Ayotzinapa Codex. It's about 8 meters long. And it's about half a metre wide, so it's enormous. And it was made as actually a prop for protest. So what the families of the victims of the Ayotzinapa disappearances would do is they would all stand together and walk down the main street in Mexico City, holding the Codex to sort of lobby for recognition from the government and to try to sort of garner some publicity internationally as well. So the story that the Codex tells, it's both images and writing. The images are taken from lots of different Mesoamerican codices, and some of them are kind of reinvented with sort of new contemporary elements. So there are bits of Códice Mendoza, there are bits of the Aperramiento Codex, but then there's also pictures of riot police in Codex-style depiction, and there's a picture of Enrique Peña Nieto, who was the president of Mexico at the time, sort of sitting on a throne as though he were a Spanish vice king, virrey. The idea is that they're saying that contemporary Mexican government is a descendant of the colonial administration.
Is it right that this codex was made in conjunction with children from the communities, or...?
No, actually. So that's sort of an interesting thing in terms of all of these new codices. There are codices that are, and political documents made by indigenous artists and communities. This particular codex, Juan Manuel Sandoval Palacios, is actually an INA, so an anthropology and heritage worker, and his son is an illustrator. Their project was one of solidarity with indigenous communities rather than, artistic agency on the part of indigenous peoples.
The ancestors will not be pleased with this ritual. Lord Tuamuzmin in his corpse bundle will not be pleased, and the 4 innocents killed will be looking on with stony faces. Lady Six Monkey, Lord 11 Wind, and his 2 adult sons. Lord 11 Wind's only daughter lives, and she too looks on with stony face. This daughter, Lady 13 Serpent, is set to marry the bloodstained king who ordered her family dead. Lord Adir will wed Lady 13 Serpent on her name day no less, to placate the other local rulers, to join the 2 houses and unite / unstable realm. An old man and young woman with hatred in her heart. Imagine for a moment the minute stillness on their wedding night after the torches go out. What fear, disgust, and horror in the dark and frozen silence. And from then on, Lord Adir has a wife, but no children follow that year or the next. There are, however, other people's children who have Lord Adir on their mind. Lady Six Monkey, his now murdered once true love, before her death, had 2 sons. Both live, both grew, and while one was serving spirits in the priesthood, the other trained for a battle and nurtured a flame of vengeance that could bide his time till he was older and stronger. And the drum beats for Lord Adir, and its sound gets slowly louder, and its rhythm gradually quickens. It whirls around Lord Adir, keeping time between his heartbeats, and it will only stop when they do.
And so what do you think the intersections here are between, like, protest signs and paraphernalia and something you'd find in a museum?
So I think that's a really interesting question. On the one hand, I think that the Ayotzinapa Codex is a piece of material culture that is a testimony to an important period in Mexican history. Secondly, I think that museums have been recently critiqued, and I think quite rightly, for their inability to express politicized positions about the very political material that they care for or own. And so what ends up happening is that effectively museums try to create cultural narratives that don't engage with some of the legacies of the colonial structures that they themselves as institutions are built on. One of the ways I think that museums can sort of engage interestingly in those debates and fight for their relevance is by platforming non-dominant and marginalised or minoritized groups. It's these kinds of protest pieces that kind of, I think, bring to the fore the very real, very violent politics that underlies some of the anger about museum collections. Where Sandy Rodriguez' piece, what it does is it says, okay, there is no real cultural border between the southwest of the United States and Mexico, and territories and cultures are effectively very fluid for a number of different contemporary and historical reasons. This codex, actually, what it does is it fractures our idea of the way that temporalities or time structures are communicated. So, for example, there is often a distinction made between Western linear temporal narratives, Eurocentric narratives that are about progress, that go, start with the birth of Christ or before the birth of Christ, whatever, and that they accumulate with every different year, and you see a timeline, and so you appreciate cultures over time in this particular way that we've been taught at school, etc., versus something like a Mesoamerican cyclical temporal conception in which there are sort of certain ideas of cyclicality and renewal that don't necessarily imply the same things about the way that society develops and don't imply an idea of historical accumulation or totalization in the way that we understand it. Those things are often divided as being two very different cultural ways of understanding time. But what the Ayotzinapa Codex does is it tells a contemporary story using historical styles, and it picks and chooses different logics, temporal logics, and cultural logics for its own purposes, for this overarching political purpose. So, for example, there's one part of the Codex where the flaying of one of the Ayotzinapa victims, so one of the victims of the Ayotzinapa disappearances, has been proven to have had their skin removed. And the writers of the Ayotzinapa Codex, what they do is they associate it with the pre-Hispanic Mexica figure Xipetotec, who is a god who wears this flayed skin on top of his own. Where a lot of archaeologists who are sympathetic to the idea that indigenous understandings of the Xipetotec figure were not barbaric and they were not about flaying sacrificial victims, etc., that would take that side of it. The Codex says that this is a barbaric thing, that the Xipetotec is barbaric, but that the contemporary Mexican government is using barbaric sort of styles of violence, against their populace. And yet at the same time, what the Codex is doing is it's saying that the Ayotzinapa victims are the Mexica, they are the Aztecs, whereas the colonial administration or the riot police and the contemporary government of Mexico are the Spaniards. And so there is a kind of cultural conflation there that kind of doesn't make, in a sense, it's not coherent. At the very end of the Codex, which I think is probably a better example, there are all these people dressed in Mexica clothing and they're carrying protest banners, and it says, the 43, we want them alive, etc. And then in the text it says, the disappearance of the warriors has incited contemporary Mexico to resist the atrocities of Neo-New Spain from neo-colonial domination. And so it looks to the future. It says that the Codex is written in a future in which Mexico has resisted those neo-colonial forces. So it plays with cultural ideologies, it plays with different temporal periods, and it effectively completely interrupts any of the coherence that we would expect in order to make the point that the artists want to make.
Definitely. And I think both in the Ayotzinapa Codex and in the Rodriguez Mondragon Codex, even if an obvious point, the comparison between the colonial Spanish and the current governments, both in Mexico and in the U.S., that involve the disappearance of people and the abuse of marginalized communities is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a way it speaks to what the codices used to be to some extent, which were resistance documents made at a time of profound, I think, cultural clash and crisis. But at the same time, they reclaim those documents for new ideas and for, you know, and they look beyond, I think, their historical context to create new materialities and new ideas.
Time passes. The world turns. The evil and the righteous share the same sky. And the sun knows all their names and all the deeds that they have done. The sun looks down on unhappy Lady 13 Serpent and her thankless marriage match. More wives will come for her husband, and children too in time. But she knows how to bide and wait. She can hear the drum beat. The sun looks down on vengeful Lord Four Wind, a young man now, 21, with a strong arm and a brave spirit, ready for the strike. The sun looks down on all the graves and fire-burnt villages. The clothes unworn, the tools unused, the harvest not brought in, lives unlived, and trails of tiny drops of red all leading to one door. The sun looks down on Lord Adair, his 52nd birthday approaching, and this sentimental older man sees a strength and determination in the youngster orphan boy, born of his once true love. Lord Four Wind, born of murdered Lady Six Monkey. The elder king wants to nourish him, to pass on skills and knowledge, to retrial his own youth again through the eyes and hands of this other. He sees something of himself in the fatherless fighting boy, and he cannot hear the drum beat, not yet.
And so the third contemporary codex that we're going to be talking about is by Mariana Castillo de Val. It was produced in 2011, and it's called El Donde Estoy Va Desapareciendo, which means the where I am is vanishing. And so I actually just saw this codex in person in Mexico City because it's at the university's Contemporary Art Museum, the MUAC. And it's very different to these other codices. I think its political commentary is a little less obvious and a little less pointed, I guess, towards a government, because the codex really just tells the story of itself, right? In a weird, weird, but
yeah, no. So
weird.
You're right. It's less of an activist piece, I think, but it is still very political, I think, though, because what it's saying is it's forcing the viewer to accept that within a Mesoamerican cosmovision, you know, these kinds of things, these books, they're alive. They're not objects to be stored somewhere in a library or somewhere in the back of a museum. They're living things that need to be interacted with by people, and they have to exist within that cultural context, in which they are spoken to, in which they are spoken with, you know, that involve these sort of careful rituals and sharpened heart, etc.
Definitely. And so the codex itself is a very long screenfold manuscript, and it's a story of the Borgia Codex, right? That's kept at the Vatican Museum. How it was it has its whole history written on the codex. So how the codex was made, from killing the deer to making the deer skin to the book, from the fictional travel to the Vatican to different, and it's very fragmented in its pictures, and it has a lot of disarticulations and gaps, just like the collection's history has. And basically the codex is speaking its own voice, right? Yeah,
that's right. I mean, I think that's why you're right when you say, in a sense, it's got a less forceful political statement behind it, because I think it's a very, let's say, erudite way to make the point. Yeah. So when you, as you say, when you look at it, the images, they're cut almost as if there's been a printing error, isn't it? So like you see, let's say half a deer and then there's a gap and then you see the other half. Because we study this stuff and we know about codices a little bit anyway, we know that this is a sort of metaphor for, as you say, these disarticulated moments in what we know about the codex history. But I think perhaps to someone who didn't necessarily have that background, that would not be a sort of really blatant iconographical statement about, the decontextualization of Mesoamerican material culture in Europe, right?
Yeah, and I think there's also a video and audio that plays next to the codex that I think tries to hammer in that point, especially the criticism to how academia, I guess, has or Western academia has dealt with this codex, and it's voices both in both in Nahuatl, Spanish, Italian, German, and it ends in English of the academic languages that sort of have parsed through this codex and rationalize the information through history, which is, I think when you see it in person, it's quite jarring because you're listening to multiple languages you don't understand and not quite understanding the content. And when you see the content, it's reading academic texts about the codex, which if you read an academic text about the codex in German from about 100 years ago, it's quite complex. It's quite complex and it's not understandable. But yeah, so what do you think her point is in criticizing academia and museums?
So I don't know, but I mean, and I suppose that's sort of, in a sense, part of the strength of a lot of these sort of quite conceptual, creative projects, which is that they're left open-ended, and we can understand that critique in the ways that in whichever way we do or want to. But if to me, I think it's a little bit about intellectual dissonance, right? It's this idea that there are all these different things and contexts happening intellectually and otherwise that are governed, yes, by geopolitics and governed by larger forces, but which survive without any proper understanding of different ways of knowing and different ways of existing in community or society. So just, for example, the languages, having everything in different languages, it speaks to how much we cannot really or do not really understand conversations that are happening in other parts of the world or that are happening perhaps next to us, but in a different language being also a metaphor for open communication. So, for example, not knowing anything about Mesoamerica, you wouldn't know that to Mesoamerican communities, these collections are living things. And so maybe she's trying to, rather than creating the bridge, because I think the bridge is variable and can be created in different ways, she's pointing to the gaps, pointing to the disarticulations, and reminding us of how intolerant we all really are to different intellectual traditions.
Definitely. And I also think if you look at the codex, there's a lot of blank space on the codex. And I think she's also making that point there, right? And also the lack of understanding of even museums that have very detailed collection history. There's a giant gap of when this codex leaves Mesoamerica until somebody finds it, until Alexander von Humboldt finds it in the belongings of Cardinal Stefano Borgia and goes to the Vatican Library, right? So, like, I think art also gives space to think about those gaps and, like, what they may be. And with an object that has its own life, I think the possibilities are really interesting.
And so it is that they go out on a hunt. Lord Eight Deer and Lord Four Wind and a group of other men. And the drumbeat is getting louder. And blessings earned from offerings sharpen their eyes to the flint tips of their arrows. And the arrows, flinging from bowstrings, catch drops of sunlight in their passage. And louder comes the drumming, and faster comes the drum. A day of energetic chasing, and at the end of it, Lord Eight Deer lies down to wild, haunting dreams. He sleeps, and in sleep see his arms stretch, his bow, and his arrow flying through the night, glinting silver in the moon, just as in the waking world, The moon glints and glitters on blades of daggers surrounding now his slumber. He sees his arrow fleeing through and pierce the belly of a coyote, just as the moonlit daggers of the waking world plunge down into his sleeping flesh. The drumming tightens to a crescendo as daggers pull out, thrust in, pull out, thrust in. He can hear it now. He can hear it as the coiled tension in his body fades towards a stillness. And slower comes the drummer, and fainter comes the drum. As the dawn rises, the last beat to fall is a single drop of scarlet red. Briefly it collects on the yellow grass, brushed with the glinting golden edge by the smiling, watching sun. It collects into a sphere that reflects all the world around it, and then falls with only a whisper to the brown earth below.
Thank you very much for joining us on our first season. We've really enjoyed sharing the recent stories and research we've been doing with the Donning-Dea Codex, which is not on display at the British Museum. If you want to find links to any of the images of the things that we've been talking about today, you can find those in the episode description.
We hope to see you on another season of Made in Latin America. This is Maria Las Mercedes Martinez Milanchi and
Laura Osorio Sanex.
Until next season.
The epic of Lord A. Deer was read aloud by Miguel Villegas Ventura. This creative reinterpretation, scripted by Jack Monahan, is based on the Donning-Dea and other Mixtec codices that mention Lord A. Deer's story. We are particularly indebted to the book Encounter with the Plumed Serpent, Drama and Power in the Heart of Mesoamerica by Martin Jensen and Gavina Aurora Perez Jimenez, and the play Recreation of the History Told in the Mixtec Codices by the community theater Yeonyu Sabi, directed by Maria Ofelia Porras Lescas.
This podcast season is made possible by the generosity of Alejandro and Charlotte Santo Domingo and Mrs. Julio Mario Santo Domingo with Andres and Lauren Santo Domingo. If you want to know more about the Santo Domingo Center, please visit SDCellar website, sdcellarbritishmuseum.org. This podcast was recorded, engineered, and edited by Prong Productions. For more information on Prong, please visit prongproductions.com. That's PRONK productions.com.